don't know me, I'm Jim Wysong. I'm the Dean of Math and Science here, and I've been at Fulton Community College for 31 years. 25 of those I was a faculty member, and among other things I taught astronomy, including in every one of my astronomy courses. I was a unit on history of rocketry and space flight. Because I used to take and had a physical prop, I don't have the book to show you, but I would hold up the astronomy book, and I would say, do you know what this would be like without the contributions made by the findings that came in through our efforts in space exploration? It wouldn't be a book, it would be a pamphlet, and we'd be done with this class in a week. We've learned so much, we have gone so far. Those of us who grew up with it, and I grew up in Kissimmee, we could watch the rockets take off. We would go over a lot of times to see them know people that we knew worked at the space program. My high school physics teacher, Mr. Tom Wells, was a launch engineer. I thought everybody's high school physics teacher worked for NASA at some point in time. We had a lot of interest and excitement in the space program in that time period, and I had fears that over time we were losing interest in it. I'm so excited to see how many people are still interested in it. Both from a historical standpoint, and we're going to talk a little bit, quite a bit about history today, but also for what it holds for the future and the promise it holds moving forward. So that's kind of a setting the stage for it. As I said, I'm thrilled. We had to make the move from 119 because when we first put this thing together, I thought, well, we'll have maybe, talking to my assistant, Dean Camacho, I said, we'll have maybe 15 people. We might have 20. We should fit comfortably in 119 here. And the RSVPs kept coming in. I said, we might have a good problem. And so I said, I have a good place for it. I also would tell you that a little plug for our science seminar series. For many years now, we have a science seminar series that during our main terms we run with all kinds of different topics and speakers. And I always send that out to the HCC email distribution. So keep an eye on that because we try to do this sort of thing and bring people in and have a little bit of something for everybody. So I think most people are probably here or on their way, and we're going to get started because I want to be respectful of your time. Our program today and how we're going to do it is I'm going to kind of give an overview of the history of rocketry and space flight going way back when, back more than 1,000 years, and then very quickly move forward to take a look at really about the last 60 or so years of that time period where so much has happened, and then even take a little peek ahead. So we're going to kind of cover that. And then Mr. Wells is going to speak with us about some things that he was an eyewitness to, worked personally with, and I think that you'll appreciate his insights. And throughout that time, if you have questions, it's an open dialogue, so just jump in. If you wait, you might forget the question. And so we'll talk a little bit about what he saw being there literally. He's in the picture. We'll point him out. In fact, I've had some fun these last few days sharing with him things that I had found that he hadn't seen himself, either ever or not in 50 years, including a video clip with him shaking hands with President Nixon. And yeah, it was an interesting time. How many of you were alive and remember the Apollo 11 launch? Yeah. And it was really something. It's one of those things you never forget, isn't it? Yeah. Well, let's take a look without further ado and kind of go through and see what got us to where we are today. George, can you see if you can bring the lights down a little bit so that this... I don't pretend to know which one of those switches is the best one to hit. Yeah, you can take all the pictures you want. You just send the royalties to Jay Wysong at HCC. Can everybody see that screen? Yeah. Well, we're going to go all the way back to China. How about that? To Wan Hu and his space vehicle. Wan Hu? Wan Hu. Wan Hu. You know, I want you to look at a couple things in this. Look at the moon. There's the moon. The moon's down to an object of fascination. He was, I think, maybe, I don't know if he was wanting to go to the moon. I'll kind of give you a spoiler. He didn't make it. Wan Hu, the Chinese developed black powder, and black powder led to rockets, and the Chinese used these rockets for a number of purposes. a long time ago. It wasn't very long ago. I mean, it wasn't very long, though, before they got the idea that maybe if the rockets could be harnessed, that they could lift somebody up into the air with them. And according to historical documents, Wan Hu had constructed a celestial chair to be powered into the heavens with rockets strapped to it. There's different reports about how many, but let's just say that no matter which report you read, there were a lot of rockets. These rockets used black powder. Black powder is an explosive, of course. And all rockets are basically a controlled explosion with key emphasis on control. And you're trying to fly on that explosion into the heavens. Sometimes it works better than others, and that is still the case today. It did not work out so well for Wan Hu. According to the reports, when they lit the fuse for all of these rockets that were tied together, there was a tremendous roar, huge amount of smoke. And if you've ever seen black powder, you know it does make a lot of smoke. And various reports that the roar became an explosion, or it was deafening no matter what. But when it was all over and done with, there was nothing. There's nothing to be seen. I don't think they ever found Wan Hu. They didn't find the Wan, the Who, or any part of him anywhere. He was gone. So I don't know. My suspicion is he didn't make it to the moon, but somebody has to go and try first. I think it's interesting, though, that people have been wanting to try it, and they've been wanting to go. When we sing the national anthem, everybody knows the words, the rocket's red glare. By the time of the War of 1812, rockets had come back into the picture again. Not much different, though, in some ways, from the rockets the Chinese used to repulse the Mongols. They were basically giant bottle rockets. Except now they were made with metal bodies, mass-produced. They had different kinds of warheads. Sir William Congreve, working for the British, built these rockets, and volleys of these Congreve rockets were used to attack different targets during the war. Those targets would be, our assets, right? Because this William Congreve was British. So when you hear about the rocket's red glare, bombs bursting in air, these rockets that were being launched against Baltimore's Fort McHenry from the rocket sloop Erebus were British rockets. And when they would take off, they'd light the sky. Francis Scott Key was held prisoner on a ship in the harbor, and with every volley of rockets, he could see if the flag over Fort McHenry was still there. And of course, it made it till the dawn's early light. Now, rockets, interestingly enough, looked like they were going somewhere, literally and figuratively, during that time period. But then something happened. This is what happens in technology. A new breakthrough eclipsed rockets. Cannons existed during this time, but they had limits to the range. They were made of cast iron and bronze. Developments in steel making and other metallurgy technology made much bigger guns much more practical. And they kind of put the rocket out of business for a while. In a weird sort of way, it also set the stage for them coming back. We'll tie that together in a minute. There's always people that dream before the people that come along and do. Sometimes the dreamers are the doers, sometimes they aren't. And these are three people who I think are very instrumental in the history of rocketry and spaceflight. How many of you have you even heard these names? Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. I always used to say a poorly paid Russian school teacher, but that's, a redundancy, right? Whether you're Russian or not. So, a math professor, underappreciated, right, Alex? Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, again, in Russia, prior to the revolution, and then after the revolution, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky dreamed of spaceflight, and he used the principles of physics and mathematical calculations to show it was possible, even if the technology wasn't available at the time. Here's three key things that he came up with, and keep these in mind. He said that for a rocket to fly into space, it makes no sense to carry all the mass with you that you no longer need. Dropping off parts of the rocket after they no longer are important would be part of any successful strategy. So the concept of staging rockets, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky saw that all those years ago. He also understood that for optimum performance, you needed to find a very, very good fuel. And that while solid fuel, in the form of black powder and other things, had been all that rockets had ever used up to that time. He said liquid fuel would be the way to go. Not only because you could throttle and control an engine and use liquid fuel, but you could get higher performance. He even went so far as to speculate on what the highest performance fuel combination would be. He said a bipropellant combination using liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen would give you the kind of power you would need to fly into space. And he said this at the beginning of the 20th century. Now here's what was so absurd about that. It was correct, yes, but what was so absurd was at that time, oxygen had only been liquefied in teaspoon-full quantities. Hydrogen, while it was believed theoretically possible to liquefy, had not been liquefied yet. And we're going to hear firsthand from somebody who worked on these advanced engines. You want to give us a hint, Tom? What was the J2 burning? Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. What's the Space Shuttle main engines burn? The same engines that were used on the SLS? Liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen. This guy saw the future before it could be made real. He already knew what it was going to look like. The other thing is he worked out all the orbital dynamics, and he worked out how to control a rocket in space. Because in the absence of air, ailerons and rudders and elevators used for an airplane don't work. Reaction controls were needed. And the ability to use Newtonian physics to figure out how to change the direction, how to pitch and yaw and roll the spacecraft. He worked it all out. Again, my math colleagues in the audience will tell you, it's pretty simple vector diagrams and trigonometric functions, right? Let's jump to Robert Goddard. 1926 is Aunt Effie's farm in Worcester, Massachusetts. The neighbors actually got the constable to go out and have a talk with him after what he did that day. He was a professor at Clark University, and he'd been working on different ideas about how to build a liquid-fueled rocket because he knew about the work of Tsiolkovsky. He had written Tsiolkovsky. They overlapped in time. He said, yeah, I think we can build this kind of an engine. And he built this thing that looked like, well, some people thought he was actually making a still, and he was just using this as cover. He built this thing, it was rickety, it was pipes, it had the rocket engine on top and the fuel tanks on the bottom. And in 1926, he lit it off on his Aunt Effie's farm. It took off, and the distance that it flew up into the air before reaching its highest point and then falling back to Earth would not have cleared the launch tower that the Saturn V rocket used. But it was the first liquid-fueled rocket flight, and the Saturn V's engines and all the liquid-fueled engines that followed used the same basic design. Oh, and by the way, that claim was successfully prosecuted by attorneys on Goddard's behalf when his widow and estate sued for patent rights and infringement for all of the designs of his that were used without any credit given. Now, there's an interesting connection with Goddard in history. There was a published report of this, almost a joke report, something along the lines of crazy professor, that's a redundancy some people would say too. They promote the craziest ones, you know that, right? Crazy professor builds a rocket ship at his aunt's farm, claims this is the way to go to the moon. They started to actually tease him about being, they called him Moon Man Goddard. And it was not a very flattering name. It was teased. A historical figure, read an account in the newspaper and said, and took it seriously. I mean, this was like a Florida man story, you know, it was meant to be a joke. But a young fellow who had just become famous for something he did read about it. His name was Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh was very interested in aviation. He had just made history in 1927, the very next year, a few months later actually, in the spring, by flying across the Atlantic. He had a lot of fame. He was thinking about the future of aviation. And he knew that someday planes might fly so high they might need an engine that didn't need air to burn. That's how far he was thinking ahead. Charles Lindbergh contacted Robert Goddard, who at first thought it was a gag and that somebody was actually just teasing him, because it was, a lot of people were joking after the story was published. And he said, "Oh, right, this is a very famous person," and you get a letter from him and said, he thought it was one of his colleagues down the hall. But Lindbergh continued to follow up, and ultimately Goddard was convinced it really was Charles Lindbergh. Long story short, Charles Lindbergh flew his plane to Worcester, Massachusetts, and picked up Robert Goddard, who'd never been in an airplane before. Flew him to Washington, D.C., and had him introduced to people at the Smithsonian and the Guggenheim Foundation, who then funded his efforts. He moved to White Sands, New Mexico, and for the rest of his life continued to build larger and larger rockets and work out the principles of rocket flight. Those were the things that he worked out, the patent issues he settled over. Hermann Oberth in Germany was working on his doctorate. His major professor, his committee chair, ultimately rejected his work and said, "This is wonderful work, but I'm going to reject it and can't grant you a degree." Some of us have been there. "You did a great job." But he said, "Why?" "Because astronautics is not an acceptable field of study." Now, his professor did say, "This, however, needs to be published as a book, not as a dissertation that goes on the shelf, because this is something that's going to be a roadmap for the future." So the dissertation that was not accepted, he did ultimately get his doctorate. But that dissertation was published as the English translation of the German title, "The Rocket into Interplanetary Space," and it became literally the blueprint that inspired a lot of people to think seriously about rockets and spaceflight. He also was in touch with Sikorsky and in touch with Goddard, and became a member of the VFR, the German Rocket Club. And there he is, right there, on the Nobel. And this young fellow who was 19 years old, a young man by the name of Werner von Braun. And he was extremely excited and extremely bright. By the way, how many of you have a younger brother? Younger brother in here? You are. My son, Austin. I mean, I can tell you as an older brother, we do these kinds of things. He used to tell the story that when he was growing up, that he made his brother Magnus sit on a garbage can and threw a cherry bomb underneath and would blow him up into the sky. And that he had dreams of space flight. He didn't think he'd make the trip. He put somebody else on it. I remember metal garbage cans and cherry bombs. That's all I know. This group was making rockets that they launched in Berlin. They gave exhibitions. People were interested. And a particular individual by the name of Walter Dornberg was interested. He came dressed in civilian clothes and very interested. He actually was an operative for the German military. Remember the cannons we left hanging a minute ago? Well, after World War I, Germany was prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles from having any large artillery. Because, in World War I, they had artillery that could fire a 2,000-pound projectile the distance from here to Orlando. So they kind of wanted to keep big guns out of their hands. But the treaty did not speak to rockets. And while Germany was rearming within the boundaries of the treaty, and they were still weak, they saw rockets as a loophole. And so they recruited Werner von Braun, who at that time I think had just turned 20, to become the head of the German rocket program. That wasn't much. It was him, a couple of technicians. I think they had a secretary to keep the books. They were trying a lot of different things. That one kind of went somewhere. It ultimately ended up in the development of this rocket, which is the first modern ballistic missile, and it first flew in 1943, I believe, the V-2 rocket. It had the ability to take a 2,000-pound projectile. That seems to be a number very alive. 1-ton projectile, could carry it 200 miles. Left the atmosphere, flew at 3,500 miles an hour. When it re-entered, it was unstoppable. The V-1 buzz bomb could be shot down. It was a cruise missile. The fastest Allied fighters and the early jets the British employed could catch it and shoot it down on top of it, really, flip it over. But this, unstoppable, by the time the rocket hit and exploded, well, you knew it didn't kill you. Because the people that had gotten it never knew it was coming. Hundreds of them were launched on London, on Antwerp, and other targets. When the war ended, we captured any of these rockets, but more importantly, we captured most of the rocket scientists. In reality, they voluntarily surrendered to us because they figured they'd get a better deal working under us than the Russians. They were right about that. Some did go to work for the Russians, and the Russians got the rocket factory. So we got some rockets and the scientists, the blueprints. They got some scientists in the rocket factory, and both of us started out pretty much with from the same starting point. That is a V2 right there, but it's at light sands. We brought these before the war had ended in the Pacific. We brought German scientists under Operation Paperclip, set them up at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and they began launching rockets in the summer of '45. But so, Mr. Welsh, before we came over today, one of the stories that Von Braun liked to tell was about one of the rockets that had a malfunction. Instead of turning north on the White Sands Range, its engine vane stuck when the gyro failed, and it made a hard turn to the south, heading right for El Paso. How many of you have been to El Paso? Just across the river is Juarez. It barely cleared El Paso. It landed in Juarez. It landed in a graveyard. Didn't kill anybody that wasn't already dead. The Mexicans didn't think it was so funny. The Germans got a big hoot out of it. They said, we're the only German task force that from our base west of the Mississippi attacked Mexico with a ballistic missile. The U.S. government didn't think it was very funny either and said, these rockets are getting too big. We need to find a new place to launch them. They found that place when the war ended. All the surplus bases were being looked at for realignment or being turned back over to municipalities. For instance, Drew Field was turned over to the city of Tampa. And a quarter of a mile from here we now know is what? Tampa International Airport. Yeah. Henderson Field, also an air base in Tampa, was turned over to the city of Tampa, and we now know it as what? Adventure Island. Busch Gardens, Adventure Island, the brewery up there, all that sits on Mobile Air Base. There was a piece of surplus real estate on the east coast of Florida. It's called the Canaveral Air Force Station. They said, this is perfect. It sticks out in the water. Nobody lives there. Rattlesnakes and, hermit crabs. If rockets blow up, and they kill anybody. We'll fire in the southeast. We can put a station or two down the coast of Florida, put some in the Bahamas, and track the rockets as they go down and crash into the Atlantic. For 1,800 miles, you could track them. And so that's how they set up the test range, and that's how they set up the facilities that ultimately became the Space Center we know today. First launch was of a V2, 1950.
Did they retrieve those rockets?
They crashed into the water. Some of them are out there. There's actually some sites that are known divers can go to, but most of that water is really, really deep. That's the Army's Redstone rocket. And really what it is a modified, enlarged, souped-up V2. The Russians had the same kind of experience. They were building on that same technology. So both of our military ICBMs and IRBMs, intermediate-range ballistic missiles, kind of started out with that. This fellow was not known by name until after he died. When he was alive, he was only known as the chief designer outside of Russia and the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev. As a young man, he had read The Rocket into Interplanetary Space. He'd read Manover's book, and he had a club in Russia that was building rockets as well. He went to work after a little time in the Gulag. He went to work working for the Soviet military, building rockets, and after the war, he became the head of their ballistic missile program. He built a rocket, ultimately his team, called the R-7. Most of our engineers and scientists call it old number 7. If it looks familiar from about here down, it's because it's the same rocket today we know as the Soyuz. The Russians, they just keep tuning up, building on the same design. We had man-rated multiple rockets. The Redstone rocket, the Atlas, the Gemini, 2 versions of the Saturn, the Space Shuttle. And we're working on additional ones now to be man-rated. The Russians have man-rated 1 basic rocket design. In 1957, October 4th, the Soviets launched a satellite into space. It wasn't a surprise. It shouldn't have been, at least, if it turned out to be. They had been saying they were going to do it, but we didn't believe they were up to the task. We thought it was just more propaganda. And then when they launched it, and it had a transmitter sending out a signal so you could verify it, they don't take our word for it, they said, a hand radio could pick it up. It was a polished sphere. It picked up enough light that if it was just before dawn or right after sunset, you could see it in the sky. It freaked people out. There's a Russian moon overhead. It's beeping. What does that beeping mean? It turns out nothing. It's just a beeper. But when people are scared, they can imagine things. It did scare the military. Here's why it scared the military. They didn't care that there was a Russian satellite flying around. They couldn't care less. Here's what scared them. To put a satellite into space, the speed that achieve orbit is about 17,500 miles an hour. If you have a rocket big enough to have delta V and accelerate something into space so it can make an orbit, by the way, following Tsiolkovsky's calculations, then it's well big enough to launch a weapon, a nuclear bomb that could leave the Soviet territory and be on top of New York City or Washington or Tampa in under half an hour, and would be, just like the V-2, unstoppable. So the military planners said, we couldn't care less about Sputnik. What we care about is they obviously had the ability to have an operational ballistic missile. And since we knew they had the bomb since 49, oh yeah, they got both pieces of the puzzle. And we were behind. Our rockets weren't as big. They didn't need to be, though, in one sense. Our nuclear weapons had more bang for the pound. But that put us behind in the space program. We'll see in just a minute. We tried to launch a satellite in 1957 as well. It was called the Vanguard. Our approach was to launch a rocket that was a modified weather research rocket, the Viking rocket. We were going to play this up as a peaceful rocket. We're not using a war rocket. We're using a peaceful rocket. The peaceful rocket got about that high off of the pad, shuddered, fell back down, and exploded, as you can see in this picture. In fact, the top is coming off even before it exploded. Now, the satellite itself actually transmitted a signal from the flames. How pathetic. Khrushchev, who we'll see in a minute, the classic Russian villain, the prototype for the Bond villains, Khrushchev had just a wonderful time. He went, ho, 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 our satellite orbits the world. America's grapefruit burns on the launch pad. It was horrible, a crushing blow. Von Braun had been working on a rocket that could put us in space. We could have been in space with his rocket in 56. Military planners said, do not have an accident and get that thing into insertion. There was some suspicion he might put propellant in the top stage, and had he done so, it would have orbited during one of the tests of the Juno/Redstone in 56. After this failure, they said, yeah, you better call Von Braun. January 31st, 1958, the Jupiter C, which was really a Juno rocket. We had a lot of intrigue with names and things in those days. It took off at night. It launched from Cape Canaveral, and it headed out over the Atlantic Ocean. They lost the tracking on it as it went over the horizon, and they knew that if it made it into orbit, that in about 75 minutes they'd pick it up at the Goldstone dish in California. And so they waited for an hour, more than an hour, about an hour and 15 minutes they were waiting. And the word came in that they got a call on the phone, and 2 words or 3 words, no words. Goldstone has the bird. We had a satellite. And around it came. Now, this was propaganda, but it was also legitimate. Our satellite didn't just have a beeper. The Explorer 1 had some instruments. It also had a revolutionary new technology called solar cells. And Explorer 1 actually picked up something that turned out to be an important discovery. If you're a young scientist, you're the guy that gets to do the stuff that the older guys are afraid they're going to get embarrassed by if something goes wrong. How many of you remember that commercial? Let Mikey eat it. Remember that cereal commercial? Ooh, I don't know. So a young fellow by the name of James Van Allen was given the job of being one of the instrument and payload designers for this Explorer satellite. He worked at the University of Iowa. Because a lot of the older guys said, we're not dealing with Buck Rogers and, Well, James Van Allen has his name attached to the largest geophysical feature of planet Earth. The Van Allen radiation belts. Yeah. Lucky break. Well, guess who's back? There's Herman Oberg. There's his student, Werner von Braun. And that's the core of the Redstone team. He was really an advisor and mentor, but von Braun's team built the missile that got Explorer 1 up. We're going to see they did some other things here as well. Uh-oh, there's Khrushchev. Ha ha ha! Yuri Gagarin. In April 12th, 1961. Yuri Gagarin. See the rocket? Look familiar? Hole number 7. Yuri Gagarin takes off from the former Soviet Union, flies all the way around the world, and comes back down. We didn't know until years later that in reality he did not land in the capsule. They weren't entirely confident of the retro rocket at the last minute stopping it, even with parachutes. So at about 3,000 feet he jumped out with his own parachute. Wow. Russian bee farmers tending their crops with animals saw this thing streak in and heard the sonic boom. Then they see a parachute. He was wearing this bulbous suit with this giant white helmet, CCCP on it. And he comes down and lands. They went at him with pitchforks. and he told them, I'm a countryman, I'm a comrade, look. And then they wondered, what kind of plane was that? He said, it wasn't a plane. He goes, he had been around the world. I've been around the world in 90 minutes. And they said, he must have hit his head. They couldn't believe it. Think, though, about what that says. Here they were with animal-drawn implements, without even a radio, but also put them in space. Ultimately, that's one of the things that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union, was those kind of gaps. Well, what were we going to do? Well, we had a manned space program, too. By 1959, we established the Mercury program. But we had a problem. Remember, the problem was our rockets weren't up to the task of lifting large weights because they'd been made for smaller nuclear bombs. This look familiar? That's the Redstone again. New paint job, different name, some tweaks. Von Braun's design, basically a Generation 2 V2 missile. The engine of this rocket didn't have the amount of thrust that the escape rocket would have pulled the capsule off of the Saturn V in an emergency. They lifted Alan Shepard in that capsule. There he is. They lifted him up 115 miles into space. It took him downrange and he landed off the Bahamas. It was a 15-minute flight. Khrushchev made a point of it, telling you that. He goes, a cosmonaut flies around the world in 90 minutes. America's astronaut takes a flea jump to the Bahamas. The fact is, we couldn't get a spacecraft into orbit for a year. We followed this with another suborbital flight, Gus Grissom's flight. Gus Grissom's flight, if you saw the right stuff and know a little bit about history, there was a premature opening, of explosive firing of the capsule hatch, and it filled with water. And while they were trying to save the capsule from sinking, he's over there saying, I'm drowning. They almost lost him. Sadly, we later did. And, weird irony, it had to do with the hatch again. Alan Shepard took off from the Canaveral Air Force Station. How many of you have been on a cruise out of Port Canaveral? Anybody? The cruise terminal's right over here. That's Jetty Park. Spent a lot of time at Jetty Park growing up. It's a great place to go. That's the jetty right here. Cocoa Beach down here. So we could stand over here and watch the rockets take off. We got a man in space finally in orbit. We got a man in orbit. His name is John Glenn. He orbited in 1962 in February. Took off on an Atlas missile. That was a more powerful ballistic missile we had. And John Glenn, well, he became a national hero. So much so they were afraid to risk him. And he knew he would not get another flight assignment. He left the astronaut corps and had a very successful career in politics as a senator from Ohio and a presidential candidate. But then an interesting thing happened. They gave him a chance to fly again. And in 1998, he flew as a crew member on the space shuttle, the Space Shuttle Discovery. 1998, and he set another record. He was our first astronaut to orbit, and to this day, he's the oldest man ever to fly in space. And when the flight surgeons gave him this examination, they said, "You know, John Glenn, you're in pretty good shape for a 35-year-old man." And he said, I'm sorry, I am getting a little hard of hearing from the propeller noise flying planes all over the years. I'm not 35. He says, I'm better than twice 35. He said, I know you are. He says, any 35-year-old man wishes he was in as good a shape as you. These guys were selected. You know the right stuff. Why the name of that movie was selected. These original astronauts, they were really something. Now, here's an interesting HCC connection to that. And it's an interesting HCC personal connection. In 1998, when John Glenn flew on the space shuttle, HCC had a payload on the space shuttle. How many people know that we had a payload on the space shuttle? Alex, way back when. Do you remember? It was our aquaculture program. Our aquaculture program had a payload on the space shuttle. And as the head of the science department, that area fell under my overview. And as a mission specialist, all the experiments have to be parsed out. And guess who had the responsibility for tending to our payload on the space shuttle? John Glenn. So John Glenn was tending to our payload, which was under the oversight of the science department, which I was in charge of. So effectively, John Glenn was working for me on that. What an incredible thing! It was an incredible thing for a lot of reasons. I remember we got to go over. We had VIP access to the Cape. We watched the launch from the VIP area. But then I found out something really cool. I'm sure Tom knows about this from being an insider at NASA. They have after parties for rocket launches. Oh man, they got carving station, they had prime rib and shrimp and everything. Yeah. And I got to meet some astronauts, and I got to meet a guy named Max Faget, who is the designer of several of our rockets, including the Mercury capsule and the space shuttle. And the amazing thing is, here's real astronauts, and here's the designer of two of our space programs, and nobody's talking to them. There were actors that were invited to this party, including some from the Star Trek movies, and everybody's wanting to talk to the actors. I'm always talking to the real astronauts. I learned some good things. And Max Faget, he's passed on now. But did you ever meet Max? He's a rather diminutive Cajun guy. And man, I'll tell you, he could put a lot of rocket fuel down the hatch. Very interesting. Of course, that's how you get the best stories, too. We choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. John Kennedy gave two speeches that were the ones that you see often parsed and clipped and melded together. The famous one at Rice University, which is the one on the left here, and he gave a speech before a joint session of Congress where he laid out the specifics. Now, let's go back in time to what had happened. Kennedy had come into office as a young and vibrant president, the first president born in this century. That would be the 20th century. That was a slight to Eisenhower, who was seen as being up in years. And he vowed to make changes, but almost immediately became embarrassed by things like the fact the Russians were beating us in space. And then there was, the Bay of Pigs. And he needed to do something to refocus the attention on our progress and see it being down the road, a big goal we could achieve, get the attention off of the short-term failures that were likely to continue. His engineers said, we're not going to match the Russians real soon, but we got some stuff that is in the works that can really pull off some big stuff, some big tasks. So he decided on this goal. This goal was of landing a man on the moon before the decade was out. And of course, the other part of that, returning him safely to the Earth, right? Because his engineers said, we got the things in development already that could probably make that happen. It would at least be a fair race, a fair shot. In the meantime, he even admitted in his speech, he admitted that the Soviets would continue to do things in the meantime that would attempt to embarrass us. But we had a bigger goal. And that was the starting point. There he is with von Braun, and an early version of what would become the Saturn rocket. You don't go from a one-man spacecraft to a moon ship in a single step. So there were stepping stones along the way. We took another one of our missiles, the Titan missile, and used it to put a two-man spacecraft into space. And it was designed to do several things. It was designed to prove that we could stay in space a long time. How many of you either own or ridden in a small sports car like a Miata or something like that? And I had a couple of Miatas and an RX-7. They're pretty tiny. No. As time went by, I swear they got smaller. Imagine sitting, even with somebody you like, in one of those for 2 weeks. In the same underwear. Eating out of a tube. We won't talk about anything else. One of the duration flights that Jim and I did, that's exactly what happened. For 2 weeks, they had to sit up there just to see if they could survive for that long. They rendezvoused with another one and docked, both with a target vehicle and with another Gemini spacecraft. They got out and walked in space, not just to say they did it, but because extravehicular activity and making a spacesuit that could survive the elements of the vacuum of space was important. It proved the technologies needed to go to the moon. And that rocket, that was a very interesting rocket. It used a nasty fuel combination. Unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, it smelled like fish, and red fuming nitric acid. Very nasty. A lot of power. The astronauts that flew it and later flew on the Saturn said the Saturn had a lot of rumble and roll, but this thing kicked you in the butt on takeoff. It also had ejection seats. Racing to the moon. If you're going to go to the moon, you got to go big, or you don't go at all. In the time that Jim and I was flying, we built one of the largest buildings on Earth. That building was big enough, originally called the Vertical Assembly Building, and later the Vehicle Assembly Building, but VAB works for either one. It had these giant garage doors that could open up, big enough to take the Saturn V rocket, which was 363 feet tall, plus its service structure, which was even taller. The building was more than 500 feet tall. Don was telling me earlier this morning he actually got to go up on top of it. So you could just about see, you could see back to Orlando. The rocket came out on one of the largest vehicles ever made, the giant crawler. 2 of them were built. They still use them. They'll be used for some of the rockets we'll see here in a little bit. And it would go 3 miles out to the launch pad at about a half a mile an hour. But when you got a rocket that weighs 7.5 million pounds, I think that's not bad at the moment. The Russians, they were in the race. There was no doubt. It could have gone either way. Sergei Korolev built a giant N1. The N1 rocket was huge. It had actually more thrust in its first stage at liftoff than the Saturn V, but it wasn't as efficient. It couldn't get as big of a capsule to the moon, but they had a similar plan. And if they would have pulled it off, their capsule or their lander that would have gone down to the moon would have carried only 1 cosmonaut. They didn't have the payload capacity to put a 2-man ship on it. Why did we win and why did they lose? Anybody have an answer? 13 times this rocket launched. 13 times they said go and 13 times it went. The worst it ever suffered was a couple of engines in the second stage that cracked out and it still made it. And that was during a test flight. 6 times they tried to launch the N1 and never did it work. And it didn't work because of something that today would not be a problem. It didn't work because they were trying to coordinate too many rocket engines. What my son said was right. It had too many engines in the stage that with electromechanical controls and early digital controls, they couldn't be they couldn't be controlled in a manner that would prevent problems that would cause the rocket to become unstable. Today, Elon Musk with the Falcon Heavy and all of that, he's got enormously within a week. If it would have worked a little bit better, they might have gotten there first. So it was a real race. Along the way, there was a tragedy. There's Gus Grissom and Ed White, Roger Chaffee. Gus Grissom was second man to fly in space, nearly drowned when the capsule hatch blew prematurely, you might recall. Ed White, he was the guy we saw here just a minute ago. That's Ed White right there. He was our first man to walk in space. Roger Chaffee was the youngest astronaut assigned to a flight at that point in time. They were about 3 weeks from launching the Apollo 1, the first manned Apollo. It would have been an Earth orbital flight to test the capsule. They were in doing a routine check. They were having some problems with communications. Gus Grissom even said something that I kind of paraphrased the other day in a comment I made to our OIP department. We're having problems with our new phones. He said, "How are we going to get to the moon, fellas, if we can't even talk among 2 or 3 buildings at the Cape?" They smelled something. It was kind of an odd odor. And then there was a fire in the cockpit. They called out, "We have a fire in the cockpit. There's a fire in here. Get us out." And that was that. The communications were cut. They got there. The pad crew was there in minutes. Couldn't get the cabin door open. The astronauts died. I mean, without looking, nobody looked. Tell me, which way does the door open? Back here, back of this auditorium. By code, it opens out. Because there's a fire in here. You want to push that door and get out of here now. The door on the Apollo capsule opened in. The irony is Gus Grissom almost died in his first space flight because the door blew prematurely. He did die on this one because they couldn't get the door open in time to get out. We fixed that. We fixed a lot of other things. These men didn't die in vain. It wasn't just something to make people feel good. They shook down that Apollo capsule. They slowed down the process a little bit. They found other bugs. And that almost certainly made our lunar landing program successful. That's the rocket that did it. The largest rocket, the most powerful rocket, the biggest rocket that has ever flown successfully and become operational to this day. There's never been a rocket as big, as powerful, as capable as the Saturn V. It was technology as the 60s, and the technology, as we're going to hear, is still some of that technology state of the art today. It was incredible. Rocketdyne, the company that Tom worked for, Rocketdyne developed these engines, the F1s, the biggest rocket engines of their time. They burned kerosene, liquid oxygen. They were tremendous engines, huge. You go to the Space Center, you can see them. The engine belt is bigger than I am tall. 5 of those engines on the first stage. That first stage was done pretty quick. Then the second stage kicked in. It used a more powerful combination. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky's recipe. Liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, the S2 stage, 5 engines, J2 engines. This is what Tom Walsh sat at the console and monitored. These were the engines that used that high performance combination to move this thing up almost to orbit. This just got it going. That got it up to literally spitting distance, as my granddad used to say, of outer space. 16,000 miles an hour, just almost the delta V to put it into orbit. Then the S3 stage kicks in, 1 J2 engine, that takes them on into orbit. These engines have the ability to be restarted. This engine would put it into orbit. It would also be used for the translunar injection. That would be when, after a parking orbit, they were ready to light it up and head out to the moon. Then that stage was dropped. Another one of Tsiolkovsky's recommendations you might recall. IBM built that. That was the computers. There's the landing craft. And that, way at the top, was the capsule. That's the only thing that was going to come back. That little spike on top was the escape rocket. If something bad went down, this had the explosive potential of a small tactical nuclear weapon. You need to get off of it in a hurry, and that's what would pull the capsule away safely. That's the Saturn V. That's what took us to the moon. That technology was built and developed, much of it from scratch, in 10 years, less than 2 years. That's the accomplishment that you have to really thank the people like Don Wells and the generation of engineers for pulling off. Why does it take so long to do things today? Well, one is that we don't put the money behind it and we don't put the urgency behind it. The other is we've become a lot more risk adverse. A lot of this stuff was tested to a far less degree of certainty than what we do today. But we did it. They made it happen. Tremendous capability. Spacecraft would take off from Earth, go once around, fire that engine up again for translator injection, head out to the moon, go around the moon. The capsule, its service module, the lunar lander, this stayed in orbit around the moon, and a landing craft with two of the astronauts transferred to it would go down and land on the moon. After they were done with the activity on the moon, only the top part of it would leave, the bottom acted as its own launch pad. If you go to the moon, launch a rocket, your own, to get back home, you got to take your own launch pad with you. So when they launched to come back off the moon, one engine would take them back up. They asked the astronauts, wow, you're sitting there thinking the only thing between me and getting home is that one engine, and if it doesn't light, you'd be there a long time. It had multiple systems and redundancies. It was hyperbolic. It didn't need igniters. When the fuel hit, boom, it lit. And it always worked. They all got back. But what kind of bravery did it take? Tom, you're there, aren't you?
I'm there.
Yeah. Let's see. You are right here. That's the firing room. This is where the rockets launch. This is at the cave. This is where all the systems are checked as the rocket is prepared. This is where everything is checked when they're getting ready to launch. If you've heard that communications loop, when they go down the line and they call out guidance, communications, propulsion, go, go, go. When everything's go, and when the count gets to 0, and the rocket takes off, they're in control. And when the tail fins clear the top of the tower, and they begin the roll program, they hand it off to Houston. Mission control takes over. But until then, it's all these folks' responsibilities. The VIP area, some of the supervisors and so on, and Thompson will talk more about this in a little bit. But this is the S2 control area, so the second stage control area. There's Apollo 11 heading to the moon. Did any of you go to the Cape that day? Who was over there? We were there. You were in the firing room, and I was 7 miles away from Bent Causeway watching. My dad, a few other people, me and about, well, the Florida Highway Patrol estimates that from Volusia County, with Daytona, New Smyrna are, down to Brevard, down about to Jetty Park, down to Sebastian Inlet. In that stretch, along A1A, along the coast, on the beaches, it was estimated 1 million people. Now, what's amazing about that? Florida's population in those days was only about 6 million. Been a great day to be a burglar. You could have robbed everybody blind. There was nobody home that day. But the burglars were there, too. It was an incredible thing. I'll never forget it. That's why my folks took me there. I remember my dad saying, boys, we were out for summer. Boys, we're going to go over and watch the fellows leave for the moon. He says, you know what? He said, I don't know if anybody watched Columbus go out to sea. He says, but you're going to watch those guys head out. He says, it's going to be historic. Here it is. We're talking about it all these years later. And it was something. That rocket, if you had never heard this, Saturn was slower on climb out than the space shuttle. It could take and go. This thing was a slow climb out and an incredible roar. The ones we watched from home in Kissimmee, 50 miles away or more, after the time for the sound to reach Kissimmee, like the way thunder was, sometime after the actual rocket, we could see the rocket. You can see it here. Several minutes would go by, and then all of a sudden, the patio doors that went out to our patio would start vibrating, and my mom's china in the hutch would vibrate. Closest thing to an earthquake we had in Florida. I'm not kidding. University of Florida Seismic Station in Gainesville would pick up Saturn launches. Karen, you were in Winter Park. You heard them. Rattled your china too. It was something. When they were going to the moon, everybody in Florida knew it. Werner von Braun watching his master work take off. President Johnson, who after his death would have mission control, the launch control, the spaceflight control in Houston, named from the Johnson Space Center. Dignitaries, and see if I can find him. He is here somewhere. I can find him when I'm looking at the power. He is back here. Right here. That bald head and that white hair right there. There's a fellow that had been kind of famous for some aviation exploits himself back in 1927. Charles Lindbergh was there as an invited guest of the astronauts. Think about that. How much progress we've made in that period of time. Incredible. And this is, again, some of the VIP viewing stands at the Cape. Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, Buzz Aldrin, they headed for the moon July 16, 1969. 50 years ago today, they were almost there. Tomorrow marks the day that they landed for the first time. I remember two things about that. Watching men on the moon, and it was the first time I'd ever gotten to stay up with my parents' permission after midnight. Kids didn't stay up late back then. When Neil Armstrong passed away, Charlie Bolden, who was the administrator of NASA, said as long as there are history books, Neil Armstrong will be included in them. 500 years, more than 500 years has passed since Columbus made his famous voyage, but we know the names of the ships, don't we? How much you want to bet in 500 years or 5,000 years? That not only will Neil's name be remembered, but people will know how he got to the moon. The most successful failure in history. We brought men back from something that should have been almost certainly a tragedy. NASA taught us a lot of things. The experience of the Apollo program wasn't just about success. Those of you that know this story, you know this is a meme. Right, Austin? Your generation. Failure is not an option. It wasn't. The work of the creative engineers, the controllers, got these men back. Apollo 13 had an explosion. If you've ever seen this picture, it shows just how bad it was. It wasn't just a little, something cracked out. They had a circuit breaker blew or something. It blew. They had a cryo tank blow up the whole side of the command module. And we got it back. Now, here's an interesting thing. I've often said if aliens landed for real and was confirmed, that'd be the biggest thing in your lifetime for about what? 6 months or a year or 2 or 3? And then after that, people would say, there's those damn aliens on the news again. I'm tired of seeing that. It's an amazing thing. Of all the people that have TVs, there's never been a time that such a large percentage of television in the history of television that people watched a single event as they did the moon landing. There's a lot more TVs today. But as a percentage of how many there were. Yet, do you realize that just a few years after Apollo 11, as a nation, we lost interest to the point that the last 3 moon missions were canceled? And we switched to use some of that technology, some of that hardware, to make our first space station, Skylab. The last launch of the Saturn V was the Skylab launch. We also flew our Apollo spacecraft on a smaller version of the Saturn rocket. So small that it had to use what they call the milking stool to hold it up. You see, kind of a booster chair when you're a kid. Saturn 1B. That was the last time it ever flew, 1975. It went up and met up with this other spacecraft. Met up with these guys. And you know who these guys are? Russians. No, they're Soviets at that time. Yeah. In fact, this guy's pretty famous. It's Alexei Leonov. Alexei was the very first man to walk in space. They beat us on that one, too. So Ed White, our first American. And they met up. They did that. It was as much a ceremony as anything else. But it was also an interesting thing. It said we should cooperate in space. And we have. The International Space Station's 2 principal partners, the U.S. and Russia. And we also didn't entirely waste our money on developing the hardware for this. You see this docking adapter? The docking adapter that was built to dock the Apollo and the Soyuz spacecraft, which had their own proprietary designs. That docking adapter was later resurrected, and the basic idea and mechanisms were modified, but it was what we used to take and fly the space shuttle to the Mir space station. And a version of it is used on the International Space Station to adapt the Soyuz spacecraft. That, oh yeah, since 2011, have been our only way to get there. The only way our astronauts have been able to get to our International Space Station, as we're a partner in, is to fly on Soyuz spacecraft. That was the Russian moon ship. That was their command module and capsule. And oh yeah, launched on old number 7, the latest version of old number 7. Tortoise in the hair, some people would say. Space shuttle was our new way to space. First flight in 1981. John Young. Orlando's proud of John Young. John Young Parkway, Orlando. When I was a school kid, he came to our school. Astronauts came to school in those days and visited with people. Backer Elementary. Tom knows where that is. He came and spoke to us. Now, granted, he lived or grew up just 18 miles away. But what a cool thing. I made it again many years later. I said, I know you don't recognize me. But we had a good conversation. What's interesting about this space shuttle was all white. They only painted the tank on the first couple of flights. And they realized the waste weight. So the orange tank used to use just a bare insulation. Space shuttle was an incredible spacecraft. It was an incredible vehicle because it could take off and come back and land like an aircraft the size of a DC-9 airliner. And we flew a lot of missions with it. But it had a compromise that was built into it. In order to get the support needed, they made it bigger and different than it was originally designed to accommodate military missions that ultimately never flew that many of. They used solid rocket boosters, which can't be throttled, but are very simple. They thought that the biggest problem was going to be SSME, these engines. These Space Shuttle main engines, they thought would be the real Achilles heel, because they were the most powerful and still are incredibly efficient and powerful engines. And they thought this could be what might bring a shuttle down. And sadly, they were wrong. These never caused a catastrophic failure. They had a few pad aborts and an engine failure on takeoff. They were able to accommodate. Here was the problem. How many of you remember this? We have to remember the tragedies and the triumphs and remember the people that were involved. And we lost these astronauts. We had only lost the 3 men on the ground in the test up to that point in time. The Russians had lost a few as well. Vladimir Komarov was lost in 1967, and they lost 3 cosmonauts coming back from the space station. When the Challenger blew up, it really was a death time. When we came back from it, we thought we were back on our track. A lot of people realized there were issues. It's a dangerous business. Von Braun laid out a plan a long time before this. He said, build a space shuttle, build a space station using it, and launch a Mars mission from it. He had a 3-part plan. But we never put the money behind the whole plan. We built the shuttle, and only at the end of its life did we build the station. And we still haven't pulled off a Mars mission. We lost another shuttle, our very first shuttle, flying in 2003 now, the Columbia, on re-entry. And this really started the end of the shuttle program. This is what accelerated the retirement of the shuttle. The irony, and the sad part of that irony, is that it broke up in view of people in Texas, where there was as much of an investment in the space program in Texas as there was in Florida. The last flight, STS-135 in July of 2011. And Austin and I watched that from Flagler Beach. Space shuttle came back, and they're now in museums. But we're going back to the future in many ways. SpaceX has a spacecraft called the Dragon that will be flying within a few months. Boeing has a spacecraft called the Starliner. Again, will be flying within a few months. Going back to capsules that are flying on, well, not in the case of SpaceX. It uses its boost rover, but an expendable rocket Boeing. Capsules that have a very robust safety escape mechanism in the event of problems. Capsules make a lot of sense. Not as sexy as a flying machine, but they're a safer way in many ways to get back to Earth. This was a design originally that NASA had commissioned, HL20, I think is what it's called. And a company called Sierra Nevada is developing it now. Sort of a mini space shuttle. It'll be flown unmanned. And of course, this looks like the Apollo capsule. It's kind of a direct descendant, except it's bigger, and it's designed for even greater and longer missions. It's the Orion, and the Orion is capable of taking us back to the moon and onto Mars or onto flights to asteroids. All of these are in development, and you'll see them fly within the next year, 2 of them. The Orion is actually already been tested. And the sons of Saturn, well, here's the sons of Saturn. They take off from the same pad. This one is a real picture. It actually is already flown twice. You remember its first flight. It took Elon Musk's sports car and a mannequin out into space. He said, I can't believe he sent $100,000 sports car off into space. I said, $100,000? Do you know how much press he got from that? How much advertising he got from that? He's a genius. That's the Falcon Heavy. And it's recoverable. And this is the SLS. And the SLS, interestingly enough, is reusing engines that we have experience with. It's using SSME, the Space Shuttle main engines. Tom has worked on as well. SLS, in its Mars version, may even be using the J2X, the modified version of the J2 engine that was in the S2 stage of Saturn. That's not because we're not creative enough to come up with new engines. It's we got it right so far, so long ago. Why reinvent the wheel or the rocket? When this takes off, it's going to shake the cake. This one's pretty loud. You probably felt it over living in Cocoa. Did you see the Falcon? I watched it from here at the Davis Island Yacht Club. I was at a meeting down there. We could see it really well. And we're going back to the moon, so that's the plan. By 2024, I wouldn't put money on that, but maybe I hope I'm wrong. But sometime soon. That's the plan. And it's probably going to happen one way or another because other countries, again, are engaging us in what is starting to feel like a race. And private industry is getting involved. Keep in mind, by the way, that's a privately funded space vehicle. That's a privately funded booster. And on to Mars. When I was a kid, I thought I'd see a Mars landing by the time I was a young person in college. Von Braun laid out a plan to put us on Mars in the 80s. And even if it slipped by the 90s. And now I wonder if I'll live long enough to see it. The technology is within our grasp today to do it. Is the will? I don't know. That's your generation, the younger of you, that's going to answer that question. I put this picture up here because Von Braun wrote this book in the 50s. Look at the ship. This is the design that Elon Musk is testing right now to go to Mars. Hey, you want to fly in space yourself? Let me ask this question. How many of you, if it didn't cost you anything, would want to go? How many of you pay, now keep in mind the younger of you that when you get older and make a little more money, that things change. But how many of you pay $20,000 for travel? How many people pay that on a cruise on like really deluxe? How many people do you think would pay even $100,000? Now in this room, I don't know. That's getting a little rich for this line. But there's people that spend that kind of money and don't even blink. Then again, not in this room. Between $100,000 and $200,000 is ticket price, and there's people already reserved and booked on both Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic and on Bezos' Blue Origin. And you'll see these flights starting in the next year or so. Suborbital flights, then orbital flights. It's a little longer than I thought it was going to take, but it's going to happen. I don't know how much I could get away with and stay married. I might find out. All right. That's enough of me blabbering. Now it's time to talk with somebody who's there to see it from a lot closer up than the Bennett Causeway. And I want to introduce our guest, Mr. Tom Wells. Tom was graduate of MSU. I know some of you are, okay, Seminoles fan. And he was, before that, a graduate of Osceola High School in Kissimmee, Florida. We both were. So I joked with my mom today on Facebook and said, we got a full house to come out and hear a couple of Kissimmee boys talk about space. Imagine that. So Brian Buffalo, as an engineer working for North American Aviation and Rocketdyne, he was a propulsion engineer for the J2, S2, the J2 engine, the S2 stage. And we've got some pictures to kind of go along with this, but I'm going to invite Mr. Wells to come up, and I'd like you all to give him a warm welcome and talk a little bit further about his involvement in the space program. So welcome, Tom Wells. Tom was in between the Apollo program ended and the shuttle began. He taught his alma mater, in mine. And so we have a disagreement on the story, but it's just a minor one. I think it's a perspective. When I was going into my senior year, he had a physics class, and it was kind of, wasn't entirely like by invitation, but people kind of got recruited into it, or were, the high school physics class. In those days, that was, a lot of people kind of said, well, I don't know, physics. Well, even as a science guy in high school, I kind of thought, I don't know physics. Cover your ears, my math guy. I was a science guy. I mean, math? Okay, I'm the dean of math and science. So I heard this word come down that, well, Mr. Wells wonders why he hadn't signed up for his class. Mr. Wells, he wants to see you. He can't understand why he hasn't signed up for his class. There's a lot of math and physics. So I went and talked to him. He said, I wonder why you haven't signed up for my class. I said, there's a lot of math in physics. He said, there's only math in physics so we can do physics and do the fun stuff. But then he told me what he just repeated a little earlier today. 2-semester class. Killed us in the first semester, and if we survived, we did fun things in the second semester. Like go to the Space Center and see Henry's launch pads. I survived. It was great.
I said there was two kinds of seniors. Ones that die in the first semester and ones that die in the second semester. So I said, if you die in the first semester, I'm going to bury you. So the second semester, we're going to have some fun. So I think we did.
We did a lot of things, and here we are 50 years later, 42 years later, actually. But it's been a while. Well, Tom, start out with you by telling us how you got involved with the space program, how the Vicinity Boy going at the shooting in mission in the firing room for a historic mission.
Okay, well, I was in the engineering science program at FSU, and one of the deans had proposed that they might put together a co-op plan where you'd work as a cooperative education student. And so he had solicited at KSC for people to go down there. And that sounds like something I could really get into. So I did that. Went there. I reported for work on January 6th of 72. I have my dates all. 1963, on January 6th, I showed up. And the first day, they had somebody show me around a little bit. So one of the draftsmen, they had draftsmen back then, took me out to pad 34, which was launching Saturn 1. And they have a service structure that fits around the vehicle. So he said, let's go up to the top and I'll show you the cape. So we ride up the elevator, we get to the top, and it's set up so that you can show off the cape itself. And so we were out there, and he told me which pads were which, and we talked, and okay, let's go back down. So we wait on the elevator. The elevator door opens, and a dozen people get off or more. We get into the elevator, and it goes down about 3 feet and stops. They had overweighted it was a NASA people bringing somebody around in a tour. So here I am in the elevator stop, and we wait for the repair elevator guy. So that was my introduction to the.
Off to a good start. Yeah. But, you know, in those days, in the early 60s, I think, how many of you have been to the Space Center? I've been on one of the tours over there. Do you remember that in the 60s, you'd go on Sundays, it was open, they would give you a pass and a map, and you could drive around in there. My first recollection as a kid, there were certain areas where you knew you couldn't go because there was generally a guy with a gun there or something. But we got to drive up around those paths and see a lot of that, and it was an exciting time. How exciting was it to work in that? I mean, that's got to be pretty cool to even, because everybody was into the space program.
Well, the guy I was working for his responsibility was putting the vehicles up, directing them on the path, and so all that equipment that was used to lift the vehicle. So we would check all that out and have it prepared, and we had a vehicle that would tow them, and of course it had to be exercised. So that got us to drive out the Cape Road right off the coast. And I don't know if you know, but a lot of that area, people lived there, and there were a number of houses right basically on the beach, and all that got taken eminent domain and folded into the center. So we would run up and down the road to exercise this equipment, and then maybe stop at a beach house and take a look at the ocean. But since then, one of those houses was taken over by the astronaut.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't it one of those, like the astronauts?
It's called the beach house.
The beach house, yeah.
And you can, as an employee, I would schedule a day that my kids would go over there and we'd have our lunch and so on. Shared with the astronaut quarters.
Yeah, because when they first started, it was really the Canaveral Air Force Station, but when the Space Center really took over a big chunk of Merritt Island. Really like that. Well, what in those early days, there were a lot of launch failures. I mean, we see those blooper reels. How much of that kind of thing? I mean, it was a race. I mean, you guys obviously were feeling some pressure. But what was the reality of that? Once Kennedy had made it clear we were going to the moon and everything was ramping up, how much of that pressure did you all really feel versus what we see in movies and such?
Personally, I didn't feel it as pressure. It was a challenge. And so, but we were working 3 shifts a day, 6-7 days a week, and so you're working 12 hours on, 12 hours off. But really, it's more than that, because when the other shift comes in, you've got to brief them on where you are, and it made for long days, and it got to be a grind. But we all knew what we were trying to do, and we were motivated. Now, in the early days, on occasion, after a second shift, I might go down to Cocoa Beach, and I could walk in the mousetrap at midnight and look around, and it looks like it might be 9 o'clock on Friday night. I don't remember the detail as far as what the median age was at that time, but it was fairly low. So you had people that were out to do good things.
Cocoa Beach was a lot of fun. Even in the 70s, Cocoa Beach was a lot of fun those days.
Well, I wanted to share one about John Young. We were on the beach side. Now, you have to understand, before the VAB was built, everything was on the beach side. And you had to come down to the port area, and when you came into work, you had to show your badge, and when you left, you had to show your badge. So there was a guard there, and you put your badge up and you waited through. Well, I'm coming down that. I was a diligent employee. I left late that evening, so it's about 5 o'clock. I'm coming south to the port, and the gate, you had to take a hard right to get to the gate. Well, as I'm getting to that curve, I look up, and there's somebody coming up on me pretty fast. And the Air Force guys over there are really strict on speed limit. So I looked and I let off a little bit. But no light or anything, so I'll just wait till he hits his light. And so I turn to go to the gate, and I'm slowing down. I look, and he's still coming pretty hard. And at that time, at 5 o'clock, there's only one lane out. So I get in that lane, the guard waves me through, and he really didn't have me slow down like he normally would. But I pulled over, because I figured I'm going to get stopped. Well, I look as I pull over, and this Corvette goes flying by me. Now, I know that the guard didn't look at his badge. But it was John Young. But those guys, they had to run the place.
Well,
and I give them the due. They really did a heck of a job.
Well, there's an interesting story. There's another good marketing tip. Jim Rathman Chevrolet over there in Brevard County. Jim Rathman Chevrolet gave all the astronauts Corvettes to drive. And of course they had Jim Rathman Chevrolet tag on. And he sold a lot of Corvettes because you wanted, if you were a young man, you wanted to have the same car that John Young had, or Neil Armstrong, or Wally Schirra. Those guys, yeah, they were something. You were telling me about how the astronauts would come and even get down into the nitty-gritty of the engineering. I mean, we think of them just as showing up to strap in and go, but they were working right alongside of you all as engineers.
Well, my favorite story there is that we had an engine failure on S2, and come to find out what happened was, I remember this right, there's two lines that go up to the top of the engine to supply liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen for the start sequence. And they're small because you're only using that to give you the propellants in the start. Well, in flight, one of them cut off and shut down. You come to find out what the suspicion was that was one of those ASI lines had broken. And suspicion was the hydrogen one because you're at minus 420, which is kind of severe on the planes. Well, I did the test fire, and then they said, that line looks solid. Now, it had a convolute, and I bought these things for a reason. What did I do with that?
Is it in this box over here?
Yes.
And I just haven't had a J2 engine diagram.
This one here. Well, this will have to do. It was similar to this. Similar to this in size, but it had convolutes so that it would give when you chilled it to minus 420. And it would, because at those temperatures, this thing is jumping around. Well, the suspicion was that is what broke. But all the testing said no. Somebody said, let's put it in the altitude chamber. Put it in the altitude chamber. And as soon as that engine fired, it was walking all over the place. So we ended up modifying the hardware. I was one of the younger guys, but I got to go to to Mississippi, which I did want to explain some of that to you, to do some test firing out there. The Apollo program did another great thing, and that is it brought the whole country together from the standpoint of we had centers in California, in Mississippi, in Texas, and here. So it had a lot of people involved. Well, Mississippi did the test firing. Now, why did we do that at the Cape? Well, you had to have another set of facilities, and one of the reasons is you couldn't fire these engines at sea level and have them run the same. The nozzle expansion difference. So out there they had that set up where they added to that nozzle so they could do the test firing at sea level. So I went out there when they brought the mod in, participated with the guys when they did the modification out there, and then we did the firing. But so we fast forward a couple of months later, we're going to deliver an engine down here with that mod in it. We put it in, and I got a call that said, I can't remember his name, was coming down, and they wanted me to go show them how the mod was done. So this is great because I've been involved in this from the get-go, and I can explain it all to them. So we go out there, and I start to explain it to him, and end up, he tells me all about it.
One of the astronauts.
This is now he hadn't flown yet. This is one of the guys that had not flown, but he's telling me about all the mod. Now, what blew me away is this is not like shuttle. They had all that command module, service module, all that hardware to be concerned about, and he's explaining it to me. So the selection process was very extremely significant, and it worked. They did a great job.
Yeah, I put the J2 engine up here on the thing. What an incredible engine, and the people I think don't realize the intricacies in rocket engines, but if there was one thing about rocket engines that I think probably the most misunderstood is that the complexity of the turbo pumps to get the fuel and oxygen in. They're as powerful, they are themselves tremendously powerful engines. So just the pumps that run the fuel in. I'm going to go back to a shot here. Let's see. Back to this shot. And so there you are right there, outside the firing room. And there were different contractors and different teams. There you go. Here's the firing room, and they're still building it at that time. This picture, I think, was in 1965, maybe. But so you work for North American Aviation and became North American Rockwell, who was a contractor that NASA had, what, Boeing, North American Rockwell.
And North American also built this stage as well as
IBM had the computers. This, again, like the different centers, the different aerospace companies came together on it. I think we got a shot here.
back up to that one, Jim. Okay, just this was, I worked on second stage. Okay, here's the first stage over here, your second stage, and McDonnell Douglas was behind us, and then you had the third stage. So this was the make up the firing.
What I like is this, the woodshed. So you get taken to the woodshed. Rocco Patron.
No, you didn't want to do that.
Didn't want to go to the woodshed. So this,
well, okay, I'll tell you the Rocco Patron story. Now, Rocco was a Air Force colonel, in my recollection, and also makes me think of the Germans as far as he was very determined. One of the guys I worked with was the supervisor for the ground support equipment, and they had problems with some of the regulators not holding up too well. So they go to a meeting, and he And he starts out telling Rocco about how he went to the hardware store and bought a regulator and replaced the one that NASA had provided. Well, our boss was there, and he was not pleased. But it was true. So he didn't ever suffer any consequences, but as Rocco, that thing got fixed quick.
Well, there's a similar story that I was told when they was trying to get STS-1, the first shuttle, going, and they were having some issues, and the story I'm told is not apocryphal, that a couple of guys went to the Home Depot over in Titusville and got some silicone sealant that they used to help with some of the waterproofing, shall we say. And it was not Bill spec, but they needed it and they couldn't wait for it to come in. So.
Well, the tile issue was a big deal, and they were working 3 shifts a day, and it was. They finally resolved. This is something I just learned a few weeks ago, because we have our once a month retiree lunch thing, and so I sat with the guy that had been involved in. They were, after they put the tile in, they would take a profile, and you're only allowed so much increase in height as you transition across that field. And so they would put the tile in, and then they'd go do this profile and find out you got to take the tile out. And that rework was just unbelievable. Time consuming. So they finally got to a system where they were able to do this profile 5 at a time, and it allowed them to turn that around.
Yeah, the shuttle, it was originally scheduled to fly in late 78 or 79, and then pushed back to 80 and finally 81. And I have an interesting recollection. I was working at Disney. In fact, of all places, honest to God, I was at Space Mountain. I was this Marlin ops supervisor at Space Mountain, and we had been told, because I had the ops briefing sheet, that NASA had notified Disney that when they were bringing the shuttle to the Cape, this was being delivered from California, that they were going to fly it on the back of the 747 and do one orbit around Disney so that the people that paid for it could see it. And if you've ever seen how big a 747 is, at low altitude, that's impressive in and of itself. I mean, and I thought, well, they got to be at 3,000 or 4,000 feet. As a pilot myself, I expected they would follow that protocol. So imagine my surprise when I see this thing coming in at about 1,500 or 2,000 feet. They wanted to give us a good look at it with a shuttle on top.
And it's not flying that fast either.
And they crank it over so we can get a good look at the shuttle. People just stopped and just in awe. It was an impressive thing. But the shuttle looked like, hard expression, looked like hell. It had all these dummy tiles. It looked like it kind of suffered some tile losses even coming from California. But there was a lot of clear on those tiles. The very first flight, I remember, they were so worried that they might lose tiles. I have this picture up. There's your jacket up there, I think. Let's see again. Here. That's you?
Yes.
Yeah, so there you are. And you got your North American jacket on. The different contractors that are over. I think a lot of questions I've heard from younger people, I've heard from my own son is, my goodness, how did you do what you did with all of that old technology? That's sort of like I hear about, how did you ever get by with all those old cars back in the day? I said, well, they weren't old when we bought them.
Let me tell this one. This is STS-11. I was a new kid on the block, so the console I'm at is supporting the guy next to me. He's the chief for our 3 consoles there for the main propulsion part. Well, on STS-14 or Apollo 14 rather, my boss said, "You're up for console chief for 14." That's great. Well, then Apollo 13 happened. They said, "No new people for 14. Can't. There's too much risk." Well, my boss said, "This guy's ready. He's ready." All right. We don't like it, but all right. So 14 comes. We get down and we're going to load the start bottles. Have a small helium tank, and around it is a larger tank that gets filled with gaseous hydrogen at a cold temperature. Now, if I remember right, liquid hydrogen is minus 423. So we're down in the 400, minus 400 degrees. We pressurized, and I don't remember the times. I'm sorry. It's the last 50 years of effective call. But we did that down around 8 minutes. And we bring up the pressure, and at that cold temp, we've already calculated how much pressure change is going to be for liftoff. And of course, it's not until S2 start, so there's time built in for the launch, for the ascent. But all that's figured out. Well, the test conductor was also aware that 13 had happened and that he better not mess up with 14. But they didn't explain to him that we were one of the critical things that we needed to be aware of. He's looking at the weather. And cloud cover moved in. We called the hole after we pressurized. Well, the guy next to me in this one, this time, is in the back of the firing room at strip charts. And another guy in the office. So the two of them are back there on the strip charts. The meters that I had to read that pressure, and this is some years ago, it's about this big with no kind of granularity. So it's an indicator only. And we have this start box that we're in. It's reading temperature and pressure. And I come in at the bottom, if I'm doing this right, at the bottom here, low temperature, lower pressure. And it's going to, over time, temperature and pressure are going to walk across this start box. Well, if it starts warming up, I have the option to vent that bottle. Reduce the pressure. What happens when I reduce the pressure? The temperature is going to drop. So I'm walking across this box. Pressure and temperature increasing, vent. Down, up, down, up. And I'm walking across the box. Only because these two guys are back there, because I got 5 engines. Now, to make things a little bit more complicated, I can only vent 2 at a time. The ground support equipment wouldn't handle the flow rate. So nobody ever thought this would happen. So those 2 guys walked me across that start box. And I don't ever recall in my life ever being so totally focused. Doesn't show in this one, but one of the NASA guys that I had worked with when I was a co-op and knew well was sitting behind me. And he reminds me, every time I see him, he reminds me of that day. But so if you can get a job where you have the kind of support that I had that day, it really builds relationships
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the thing when you take a look at the age. I mean, I mentioned this to you, I think, in one of the emails I sent, that you look at SpaceX and where they are today, it looks a lot like where you guys were in the 60s. They've got a lot of young people in there. They've got some senior people that are mentors. They're building a team, and they're keeping a team together, which, is kind of what happened through our program. That's a big concern now. It's been so long, the continuity of what's going to happen when we do restart with new SLS. You guys are going to be a little hard to get a hold of, when you're doing the things you do as retired fellows.
Okay,
Back to run the rockets again.
two guys that had worked for me just went to work for ULA a couple of months ago, and that was their focus. Is they have a senior group that's there now, and these two guys are supposed to go in and trying to capture some of that knowledge base.
Yeah, well, and that's it, because as I alluded to, and we'll talk about this in a bit, the engine technology for the new SLS, the new Saturn, if you will, it's going to use space shuttle main engines, the RS-25 engines. The J2 engine in a modified form is going to probably be back. So the guys like you that worked on that knowledge is absolutely still vital to the operation of those engines, and if they don't capture that, Austin does his volunteer hours down at this Victory ship, which is a World War II ship down in the port of Tampa. And they have to bring in retirees to explain how stuff on that ship works, because there's not a lot of people that have worked on a World War II ship, and we're only 15 years really less time with regard to this technology. So I'm glad to hear they're capturing that knowledge.
One of the Rocketdyne technicians that I worked with went back to University of Florida after he'd been working there a while, and I hired the co-op to come in from the University of Florida, and he knew Neil, and he said they had these different study groups, and he said you wanted to get into Neil's group because when you came, you were going to cover all the material. Now you better come prepared, or you wouldn't be invited again. So Neil graduated, went out to California for an interview with Rocketdyne, and they talked about the job and whatever, and the guy said, "Here's your offer." He pushed the paper across the desk, and Neil looked at it and said, "You don't understand. I took those engines apart and put them back together 50 times. I know them." Took the paper and pushed it back to the guy. You better do better. He went to work for Rocketdyne and then went to SpaceX.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw him. This is in 2013. Yeah, 2013. I talked to him. He was back at the Cape and working for NASA under a contract. But he said that they would take those engines apart and put them back together, and then go test fire again, tear them up, and do it all over. So I think they've got that engine.
Yeah, that's really something. What do you think? I mean, again, living right there, what do you think about SpaceX flying those Falcon boosters back? It was only about 2009 or 10 that Musk first teased that, and United Launch Alliance and other legacy contractors said, "Oh, that's animation. Anybody can get somebody that's good with animation and show that." That's 20 years from now if they ever pull it off. And 3 or 4 years later, they landed the first booster, and now they're consistently flying them back. Plus the technology on these new engines, these Raptor engines, which have the ability, if need be, to burn liquid methane, which he's obviously looking ahead to Mars. And this guy he's doing this without a lot of government subsidy. So what are your thoughts? And then Bezos, his rocket engine looks like it's a state-of-the-art engine too.
Well, several months ago was the first time that I saw the Blue Origin building, and it's larger than the VAB.
This is Amazon's owner that's got his own space program.
And so he's got a building on base. NASA has got some property that they're leasing out to different companies. So NASA's, I think, treating your money correctly and recapturing some of it, renting this stuff out. But they've got a heck of a building there. SpaceX has got the Pad A facility.
The Apollo launch complex 39 had 2 pads. So we're going out. The crawler way went out. And there are 2 pads. So SpaceX is going to use one of them, or is using one of them for the Falcon Heavy, and the SLS is going to go off of the other one.
For Pad B.
And it's amazing to see, again, that picture. I think that's the picture I got back here. Yeah, so this is the real picture, but this one is the artist rendering. If it's the actual photograph, they've just put the rocket into it. So there it is, the same pad that we launched the lunar missions and the shuttles off of. Being used for the future. We've got a pretty good return on our investment.
VAB, when I was working on this too, we had an office on the 15th floor, and to get over to the cafeteria, I had to go across the highway. There was a catwalk, and I would walk across there and look down, and they would bring visitors in at the end of the VAB in a little caged area. And I would look down at those people, and they looked like ants. And then I'd say, I'm only halfway up. The building is huge. I always turned down. I had a couple opportunities to go up on the roof. I always turned it down. I don't know why. When we were ending the program, I was able to get to this center director, and they allowed me to have a technical interchange meeting, which is code for invite the old people back. So I brought back, we had over 100 show up for 3 days in the next building over. It's a new building now. But, so
Order processing? OBF?
OBF 2.
Yeah.
So I said, hey, it's a good idea to work something to go up to the roof. So we went up to the roof. I don't know why I ever turned it down before. You can see forever. They have some meteorological equipment on top of the roof. Makes sense. And they're up on a platform. Everybody that had to go up the extra 10 feet to get 10 feet higher. You can never get enough. Anyways, it was a beautiful day, and it's great.
Well, I think it's a good opportunity now to see if there's some questions that you all might have. Yes, sir.
Did you ever experience any of the weather inside that building that you hear about? You hear about there's clouds that form in the.
I've never seen that. Now, like I say, I've only been up, generally just halfway. But I know that was.
It rains in our science building a little, but I think that's from a different.
They say that the height of it and the
Right.
humidity in Florida and stuff that there actually forms clouds sometimes. So I don't know if that was anecdotal or.
I can't testify to that.
Other questions or thoughts? Tom, what about the space shuttle? We focused, because of the anniversary, we've been focusing on the Apollo. But the space shuttle program, when you returned and went back to work at the Cape, and you were involved in the space shuttle program, of course, as we saw in the historical presentation, everybody remembers where they were on the day that the Challenger was lost. Can you share a little bit about your experience on that day and what followed?
Okay, I was in the fire room, and I was the lead that day for the council. And the council that I'm at is, we're looking at all the engine data. And so I'm watching the data, and it's set up so that if it goes out, if a measurement goes out, that'll turn red. So it's talking to me, not only just the numbers, but the display is talking to me. And everything is fine. My NASA guy was standing behind me, tapping me on the shoulder. So I turned and he said, just pointed up. So I looked out the window, and I could just see some smoke. I didn't really see anything. So I looked back at the console, and the data was still there, but I have an ability to hit a button and bring back the previous 3 minutes. It would come back and display. Never used that before. I don't know what they had in mind when they did that, but anyways, I thought that was a good feature. So I hit the button. As soon as I did, they had already locked it up. They had a procedure that if anything went bad, they lock everything up. All the consoles are locked, so you can't do anything. To this day, I do not know how long we were in that room. Time didn't have any meaning. We bring a lot of reference material with us, and that's sitting behind me. All that had to be left. Nobody left with any material. Now there's 300 people in that room, and you could hear it then drop. Everybody was just devastated. We had the right crew at that time. Krista McAuliffe was a super advocate that was selling the NASA program so we were one with her. I don't know how long I was there. I think it was about 6 to 8 weeks that I got my reference material back. What my boss had me do for that was, because it was right here, the Navy was able to bring a lot of that material back, and given the altitude, whatever, a lot of it was fairly intact. So my job was to go through what was our equipment, identify what was ours, and document which parts, and left and right. We had to come up with, so we had to get down to serial numbers to document which. And then, after we got everything identified, then it was decided they were going to put all of this in you knew more about
they had a Minuteman missile silo for testing, but it wasn't using when they used that as a tune.
And they were smart. Whatever went over there got all cut up so that nobody could say, I've got a piece. So that, which then brings us to Columbia. That day was a Sunday morning. I was at home. One of the guys was on console because, as part of re-entry, they repressurize the manifold so that you don't bring any air into the manifold, because we don't like air. So he's there to monitor for the re-entry because we pressurize and we document. So I called him. We were in the blackout period, and so I said, Mike, we got data back yet? He said, no. I said, well, see, he didn't, I knew more than he did, because he's just on the console and watching for data. And I said, well, I don't think you're going to get it back. So subsequently, I sent people out to Texas, and they literally walked the field, and they brought, the smart thing they did was they brought a lot of forest fire haters in from the west into Texas, and my guys walked with them. They shoulder to shoulder walk and find hardware. They came upon a big hole in the ground, about 12 feet deep, and they said, that's one of the engines. So they went, and finally did a couple days, got it out, but it wasn't an engine. It was just the top of the pump. So that was the kind of force that thing was coming in. So the facilities are just off the runway. They have a hangar there. Mm-hmm. Everything was taken there and set up like they would for a airline crash, and all the data, all the hardware was set out. And one of the guys that I knew, one of the technicians, told me about, they brought in the landing gear and brought it in on a truck. This is weeks later. So he's out there to help them offload it, and he said, that ain't ours. He said, I don't know where you got that, but that came off of something else. That's not ours. And I said, they're saying that it's the landing gear. He said, now this landing gear is huge. And he said, I've worked on it for 10 years. I would recognize it. But that's the forces in the heat, because all the bracketry that was on it to hold telemetry had all been burned away. So the forces coming in, the heat had to be just but there was other stuff that would come in and
there were papers and things that were intact. It decelerated so fast that we just walked it.
Well, one of the guys that went out from my office, they found an instrumentation container that looked like it had been dropped off the back of a pickup truck. The whole corner was bent. And what was significant there is it had data that was recorded in flight that was not telemetry back. So it was another resource that they had to evaluate. So that was a fortunate find.
Well, the other thing I think was Columbia had that vestige of being the first shuttle so instrumented. It still had all the instruments that they put in for the flight development. It helped them investigate the accident to a greater degree than it's been with one of the later shuttles. I remember that morning well because we were expecting sonic booms, and my wife and my mother-in-law, who was down at the time visiting, were watching. And how many of you remember Yolanda Fernandez? She actually works for the Sheriff's Department now as a spokesperson. She was the Sunday morning news woman. And I was waiting for the sonic booms. I knew about where in the flight re-entry we would hear them. And I poked my head back in, and Donna said, there's something wrong. And I said, what? She said, Yolanda Fernandez just came on and said, the shuttle's overdue. And I looked at her, I said, the shuttle's never overdue. I said, the energy management on that, they know where it is down to a few hundred meters at any given time. I said, that's bad. And then we watched, and of course you could tell that she was hearing something in her earpiece. And I said, this isn't good. I said, this is something bad. Something bad has happened. I said, and then when the time came for touchdown, and it wasn't there, well, it doesn't take a lot to figure out something. Around that same time, they were seeing debris, what looked like a meteor storm over Texas. Well, yeah. what a tragedy that was. Again, people think going back to capsules is a step backward, but the ability to survive ascent accidents is so much greater. And for that matter, even re-entry. The fail-safe mode of capsules is ballistic re-entry. So there's a lot greater safety in doing it the old way. The irony, I think, is we've kind of gone back to realizing that. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I'm just curious, was it the tiles that came off and the heat got inside when they broke through?
The carbon on the front of the wing which is a heat-resistant material, was broken by a falling chunk of ice. It left a gash that was only about that big, about that long, but the plasma, superheated gas on the entry, got in that crack. The shuttle is highly insulated from the outside, but when the hot gas got on the inside, it's all just aircraft quality aluminum, and it started to damage things. One of the engineers knew, when they suspected there could have been a problem after takeoff, which they did not inform the astronauts of, he took it upon himself to kind of go through and figure out what a failure scenario would look like. And he figured that certain things would happen and certain sensors would activate, and the tire would probably over-pressurize. And he said, this is the sequence. And he shared it with one of his friends. And when that started happening, they had the first hint that bad things were coming. But the old Columbia, to her credit, her onboard flight computers compensated, went to the full stops to keep it, because the wing was literally coming apart. And when it reached a certain point, it went into a flat spin. And that was all she wrote. You can't recover from that. But, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do we need to have a moon base before we try to go to Mars, or can we go straight to Mars and move over? Or moon over?
I don't know. That's
It's not resolved.
there were what, three different proposals to get to the moon. There was a direct ascent, there was an Earth orbit rendezvous, and a lunar orbit rendezvous plan. And any of them would have worked. They just had different engineering challenges. There's no reason to have a moon base to go to Mars except to perhaps build more experience. Some people would say to actually stall for time. And we could fly to Mars with the technology we have now. The problem with Mars is it's a lot further away than the moon.
By the time you get there.
Yeah. And if you have problems, you ain't coming back in 3 days. And there are other challenges that we don't even know of. Some of those challenges might be able to be explored or modeled on the moon, but the moon and Mars are two different worlds. So many things that Mars will present as challenges are unique to Mars.
Like taking off? Because of gravity?
Yeah, Mars has more gravity than the moon, less than the Earth. Mars has an atmosphere, so there's a re-entry issue on Mars, there isn't on the moon. There's a lot of challenges. I think that probably the simple answer is it's not necessary. Will it be part of the plan? It looks like it will be. I think that's what we're hearing now. We're going to go back to the moon. I think from a political standpoint, it also provides a goal that's achievable in a shorter term.
Well, and also if it proves correct that there is ice, water, whatever, there's an oxygen and hydrogen there that you could fuel on.
Right, and
take off from there and carry a lot less weight.
And there's some truth to that. I think the bigger benefit there is learning how to use on-planet resources in a real situation would be a good driver in the boat. What he's speaking of is what we didn't know when we went to the moon the first time, is that in those craters in the lunar polar regions, we now verified that there is water ice down in those craters. The moon is inherently dry, but comet impacts have deposited water ice in places where it hasn't sublimated back into vapor. And you break water down, you get hydrogen and oxygen, and you got rocket fuel and something to breathe, something to drink. you're good to go.
When I read, there's also some issues with genetic changes that happen to the human body when you have long-term space travel, and that's happened to some of the astronauts that have been up for over 100 days, 200 days, and some serious issues that they faced coming back.
And that's an interesting thing because, again, when you're outside the Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere, the protection it offers from cosmic radiation is gone. And there's a trade-off, an engineering trade-off. How much weight can you afford for shielding? How much protection can you afford to provide the astronauts? And so think about it if we talk about a long-term presence, because it's a cumulative dose. It's like going to a nuclear power plant. If you visit a power plant, hey, that's not as bad as getting an X-ray at the dentist's office. If you work there, it's a different story, right? That's a good point.
Just an airline pilot.
Sure.
15,000 feet.
Absolutely.
The risk.
Other questions or before we wrap up today? No other questions? Well, please, again, express your thanks for coming here. I'm sure he's not going to bolt out of the room. If you have a question or do you want to come and ask him as we're leaving, I'm sure he'll take time. And he's got
I've got a few pieces of equipment, not terribly interesting, but.
And thank you all for coming out today.